it's Alabama Annie, and welcome to part 18 of the Starlight Tavern, one of my books available on Kindle. We all sing along to the Christmas tunes, but that got me to thinking. We asked permission to go outside and bundled up in our coats and mittens and gloves and went out to build our Christmas snowman. We rolled the snow into different sized balls and stacked them atop each other until Jamie had to stand on a wooden crate to put the snowman's head on his body. Then we found sticks that had fallen from the trees in the front yard for his arms, and Lenny raced around to the cold house and brought several lumps of it to make his eyes and mouth. Mr. Harvey brought out an old scarf and straw hat for the snowman from the garden shed and placed the hat on top of his head, producing a bright orange carrot from his coat pocket for his nose. When we were done, he was a handsome fellow. Everybody said so. We should give him a name, Lenny exclaimed. Let's call him Mr. Snow, Jamie suggested, and that was just the perfect name for him. That evening, we got to stay up late, way past our bedtimes. We sang more songs, we played games, and snuggled around the fire. But finally, everyone said goodnight and drifted off home. It was 10 o'clock before I climbed into bed. The next morning, the roads were clearing, and I was sad to see the bakers go after breakfast, but they were headed to their grandma's house for the next round of their Christmas. We stood on the porch waving goodbye as they drove slowly away toward the Georgia line. After dinner that day, we all settled in around the tree, and I remembered Aldous had promised he'd tell us a story about Little River Canyon. The one about the ghost horses? I asked. Aldous thought for a moment as the room quieted down before he began. The Battle of Lookout Mountain had begun, and the Union Army was moving into the area, and the Confederate General Joe Wheeler picked 11 of his best men and sent them on horseback to scout the remote area they called Mays Gulf for signs of the enemy during their campaign. Wheeler knew from his study of history that the Gulf had been used by enemies during the Revolutionary War as a hideout, and many times before that. He knew there were many places in the canyon where the enemy could be seen from a great distance. Upon arriving on horseback at the south rim of the Gulf, somewhere above Collinsville, Alabama, Wheeler and his men began patrolling, afforded a good view from their vantage point. On the first day, they found nothing unusual. They camped that night on a flat rock overlooking the canyon. The next day, they continued on, finding no signs of the enemy, convinced there was no danger laying in wait for them there. And then Wheeler made a decision to split up the party, taking some of his men with him and leaving the others to continue the patrol. The remaining men continued riding around the canyon and looking, but late afternoon, as they rode along the rim, very close to the edge, a wild wind began to blow, and clouds gathered as a thick fog enveloped them all. It was hard to see any pitfall. The horses began to snort and fidget, sensing some danger that the men could not see, and one of the soldiers shot off his sidearm in a panic. Then suddenly, several of the horses and their riders bolted and raced out over the edge of the precipice into thin air, the men screaming in terror as they realized that they were doomed. One soldier was able to leap from his mount before his horse became airborne, and he clung to the edge of the cliff by his fingertips, looking down in horror as his friends fell into the depths of the canyon below, swallowed up in that fog. The cries of the men and the screams of the horses soon died away as the canyon fell silent. Terrified, the lone soldier managed to climb to the top of the cliff again, pulling himself to safety on the edge, and there he lay, catching his breath and trying to figure out what to do next, when he heard a low growl and he turned his head. He saw a massive black panther racing toward him from the tree line. The men let out a cry as he rolled aside to dodge the oncoming attack from the cat and watched stupefied as it too dove over the edge, just as the men and horses had done, and vanished into the fog. Alone and frightened, with no way to make fire and no weapon upon his person save the knife he carried on his belt, the man spent a sleepless night huddled against a rock outcrop in the cold and the damp. At daylight, he was able to get his bearings and began his long trek back to civilization. About midday, he came upon some soldiers, and they directed him to the place where General Wheeler had camped and gave him a horse to ride. He rode the horse into the camp and reported the incident. General Wheeler and the soldiers, along with 4 other men, returned to the spot where the canyon rim had been enveloped in fog, and where the soldiers and horses had gone over the side, sending down a search party to try and recover any remains they could. But when the party reached the canyon floor, there was no sign of any of them, and soon a story sprang up, a legend of ghostly riders and horses seen on several occasions galloping over the rim of the canyon, always followed by the appearance of a large black panther. And they saw that the horses and men fell under a Cherokee curse designed to protect the canyon from intruders. And the panther is the spirit animal of the medicine man who made the curse. He ended the story by telling us he had once seen the soldiers and horses for himself when he had been to see someone who lived on the canyon rim. And I, for one, believed him. Then, without another word, Aldous stood, he threw on his cape and scarf, he thanked us for all the Christmas joy, and bid us good night, stepping out the door into the snow. And when he was gone, I asked if I could go and check on the snowman. And there he stood in the moonlight, just as perfect as when we'd built him. But then I noticed something strange. There were no footprints in the snow where Aldous would have walked. There was no sign of him walking away. How could that be? How could a man walk off the porch into the snow and not leave footprints? I looked out into the darkness and suddenly felt chilled. I hurried back inside. Meanwhile, Mr. Snow stood in the front yard until just before the new year, long after the snow began to melt. The night before New Year's Eve, I was standing on the front porch steps after dinner looking up at the stars and the clear night sky when I heard a sound to my left. I stood still and listened, and I heard the sound of horses and the jingle of harnesses, and I saw the eerie glow of the ghost wagon's lanterns. I felt frozen in place, but I managed to run back inside. Miss Hattie and John were sitting beside the fire in the parlor. I ran to her and said I was frightened. "Why are you afraid, Maggie?" she asked. "I think I just saw the ghost wagon." Hattie moved over in the chair to make room for me and put her arm around me. "Maybe it was just someone out for a ride in the snow," she suggested, saying that it was such a beautiful night, a lot of folks might be out, but I wasn't sure she was right. That night, I had a dream that the ghost wagon was stopping at the tavern, and when I awoke, it took me the longest time to go back to sleep, but morning did come, and it was a busy day. That afternoon, Mr. Harvey got all dressed up and told us good night as he left for a big party he was going to attend in Chattanooga. And Aunt Mary was getting all pretty in her room for her New Year's Eve gala at the hotel. She had ordered a beautiful dress for the occasion. It was black velvet with silver embroidered swirls across the shoulders and the front of it. There were matching shoes and a silver wrap to go along with it, and I thought it was beautiful. She was sitting at her dresser finishing up her hair, and I was on the bed with Betsy McCall watching her get ready when Aunt Hattie came rushing through the bedroom door, and she looked terribly upset.